Hello, everyone. I am Aida Casamichana, Executive Director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Spain, an organization that, as you may already know, serves as a platform for networking, advocacy, and knowledge sharing. And on behalf of our chairman, Jaime Malet, who has announced that would be conducting this presentation today, I want to excuse him due to a personal last-minute impediment that has made it impossible for him to be here with us. Also, I want to thank you for joining us today, exactly one day before President Joe Biden reaches his 100th day in office. As you know, it's a symbolic achievement which is frequently used to evaluate a new president. The past months have demonstrated that President Biden's approach is dramatically his predecessor. In particular, our chamber celebrates that the Biden administration has. Wait, hold on a second. That the Biden administration has moved toward improving the transatlantic relationship. Just to name a few, some highlights worth noting are the U.S. rejoining the World Health Organization and signing of the Paris Agreement, the suspension on tariffs on European goods, easing the trade tensions brought on by the Boeing Airbus dispute, and finally, the recent announcement of President Biden's first trip overseas in Europe for the G7, NATO, and the US-EU summits, reaffirming his commitment to international cooperation on key issues such as global health, climate change, economic recovery, and defense. And polls are showing that Americans largely approve of the job that he's doing handling the pandemic and the economy overall. So today, I am pleased to introduce you to the following key experts and opinion leaders located in Washington, D.C., that will assess the past 100 days of Biden's presidency and discuss the new administration's approach to foreign policy, the legislative agenda, as well as the political climate in the nation's capital with us. Former Congressman Toby Moffett, an active Democratic Party strategist and current co-chairman of Mercury. Amanda Mars, U.S. Bureau Chief of El País, who has been with the newspaper since 2006 and has received several awards for journalistic excellence. And finally, today, Masters of Ceremonies, Patrick Costello, the Director of Washington External Affairs of the Council on Foreign Relations, who regularly engages with the policymaking community and the foreign diplomatic corps on a wide ranges of foreign policy and economic issues. So before dismissing myself and on behalf of the Chamber and its member companies, I want to thank the three of you for agreeing to participate on this event and share your insight with us today. So Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ada, and thanks to the Chamber for convening this discussion. I know a virtual conversation is a poor substitute for an in-person exchange of views, but we'll do our best to address some of the issues that Ada laid out and also have an engaging Q&A following the initial framing comments. I'd just like to note that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the foreign policy inbox for President Biden was daunting when he was sworn in on January the 28th. A quick scan of the headlines today reveals just what a complex world we live in. One very broad point that I'd like to make at the top is that there's far greater emphasis on the connectivity between U.S. foreign affairs and American domestic politics than under President Trump or President Obama. And over the next several minutes, I'm going to quickly provide an overview of the most pressing items on the foreign policy agenda, addressing great power competition, alliance management, and some other foreign policy challenges that are taking up bandwidth for senior officials. And then I'll finally close on a word on transnational concerns that necessitate robust coordination with allies and partners to properly address. We must first talk about China, and we could spend the entire hour discussing U.S.-China competition, but I'm going to limit my comments to the most recent developments and potential flashpoints. So far, relations are tense, and a number of analysts say that they're at their lowest point in decades. As you know, Secretary of State Blinken met with Chinese counterparts in Alaska in mid-March. It was an extremely heated exchange that really broke down with both sides excoriating the other for breaching diplomatic protocols. The administration has underscored the importance of both collaboration and confrontation, and those 2 days of tough and direct talks yielded no diplomatic breakthrough. I think that the diplomatic exchange illustrates the difficulty of the relationship. Now let's get into some potential flashpoints. First is the matter of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. The prior administration called the matter a genocide. The Biden administration has sanctioned Chinese officials in connection with serious human rights abuses. We're also ramping up customs efforts to detain goods produced by forced labor. There's legislation moving on the Hill authorizing additional sanctions. Another matter of concern is trade. As you all know, former President Trump sparked a trade war that's still raging. Newly confirmed U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has signaled an openness to trade negotiations with China, but the administration is keeping the tariffs in place and has tightened controls on technologies they believe are helping China's military. Another source of tension is Hong Kong. We're nearing the 1-year mark of the sweeping national security law on Hong Kong that was imposed by Beijing. Taiwan. This is an issue that really keeps folks in Washington up at night. The Chinese have recently conducted live fire exercises near Taiwan. There have also been large incursions of Chinese warplanes into Taiwanese airspace. Things are getting very heated across the strait. China's also a focal point on Capitol Hill. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee recently passed a sweeping bill on China. The House Foreign Affairs Committee is expected to spend much of May on China-related legislation. There's a high degree of bipartisanship around the idea that China, under its current leadership, poses a serious threat to U.S. values and interests. And there are other issues related to China, South and East China Seas, cyber, that we can get into in Q&A, but I'd like to pivot to Russia for a moment. Now, on the Russia question, foreign policy experts are divided on how serious a threat Russia poses to the United States and its interests. And we can get into the contours of that debate if you'd like during the discussion portion. But the president has promised to be tougher on Russia than President Trump and to take a more muscular stance. He caused some ripples last month by agreeing with the description that Russian President Vladimir Putin is a killer. And just recently, tensions have escalated even further. For weeks, Russia was amassing troops near its border with Ukraine. Last week, they announced that those exercises have been completed. Nevertheless, it's extremely provocative to amass 100,000 troops near the Ukrainian border. And while the immediate threat of invasion may be subsiding, tens of thousands of troops remain within striking distance of Ukraine, and there's no end in sight to the long simmering conflicts in the Donbass, not to mention their presence in Crimea. Last month, the Biden administration announced a series of measures punishing Russia. There's new sanctions prohibiting U.S. banks from buying Russian government bonds. We sanctioned 32 individuals and entities over attempts to influence the 2020 election. We expelled a number of Russian diplomats. The administration also formally accused Russia's intelligence services of carrying out the SolarWinds hack. Another point of friction is the matter of Alexei Navalny. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has warned of consequences if Navalny dies due to bad health. But thankfully, he's gotten medical attention and seems to be on the mend. There are other issues that cause friction within the relationship that we can also get into during the discussion. But I think it's important to note about Russia that Putin is facing a number of internal challenges, from the virus to protests to popular discontent and declining approval ratings. There's also legislative elections this fall, which must worry Putin. And I'm sure a number of you have read coverage of Putin's annual State of the Nation speech last week. His rhetoric was pretty bellicose, and in recent weeks, he's seemingly fallen back on a tried and true tactic to bolster his fortunes, and that is fanning nationalist flames. Now, the twin spats with Russia and China raise a question on whether Biden will seek to forge productive relationships with them, or whether confrontation and conflagration will be the new normal. And regardless of how these geopolitical contests unfold, the Biden administration has departed from its predecessor when it comes to alliance management. In a speech at the State Department in February, the president said he would work to repair our alliances and said that they were necessary to meet the challenges posed by Russia and China. And early in the term, the president and his national security team are trying to reform the habits of cooperation and rebuild the muscle of democratic alliances that have atrophied over the past few years. Biden further stated during his State Department address that America's alliances are our greatest asset. And early moves have borne this out. There's been sustained engagement really since the inauguration by the president, the Secretary of State, among others, with alliance partners. And the strategy of the Biden administration is quite clear. The centerpiece of the foreign policy is the competition between democracies and autocracies. And this is happening at what the president has called a historic inflection point. Autocracies are inspired, if not led by, the example of China as well as Russia. And the administration aims to rebuild alliances with democracies in Asia through formats like the Quad and democracies in Europe through NATO. And we're also seeing some interesting connective tissue developing here. You have the French Navy leading military exercises with the Quad recently. You have Japan and Germany pursuing high-level strategic dialogues. So this more robust alliance management is actually creating a greater enabling environment for other partnerships to develop, which are mutually reinforcing. Now I'd like to pivot to some of the legacy issues and more discrete foreign policy challenges. First is Afghanistan. Nearly 20 years since American troops entered Afghanistan, the administration announced the withdrawal of all troops by September 11th. A decade ago, there were over 100,000 American troops in the country. Now there are about 2,500. With the Taliban increasing its influence and its violence, analysts, diplomats, and some of the president's own generals advised against a complete withdrawal. But Biden has a long history with Afghan policy and has long been a skeptic of America's involvement. And so it's no surprise that American troops are withdrawing, and the pieces were already in place. The president inherited a deal that the Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban last year. Under that agreement, America agreed to withdraw pretty much all of its troops by May of this year. In exchange, the Taliban agreed to stop attacking American forces, give up their links with al-Qaeda, enter into negotiations for a political settlement with the Afghan government. Now, not many people believe that the Taliban has stuck to that deal, but for Biden and in the context of American politics, a withdrawal is understandable. Most Americans think that the war has gone on for too long and they want out. They also believe that the war has served its original purpose, that we went in to ensure Afghanistan would not be used as a base from which terrorist attacks could be launched against the American homeland. There's also been a lot of pushback on this decision on Capitol Hill, and we can get into that later if you'd like. I'd also like to raise the issue of Iran. The issue getting most of the attention is the nuclear file. And for the purposes of sequencing, just to remind everyone, the original deal was signed in 2015, painstakingly stitched together with Iran, the United States, Russia, China, and the E3. Former President Trump pulled the United States out of the JCPOA in 2018. Iran then breached the terms of the accord in 2019, having complied with the terms up to that point. And as you know, talks have resumed among the main parties to the Iran nuclear deal with the purpose of bringing all the parties back into the deal and back into compliance. The problem is that there's plenty of ill feeling lingering from the Trump era withdrawal, which Iranians view as a breach. Now, careful choreography will be required since both the United States and Iran are demanding verification that the other side will follow through on its promises. Many hope for a deal by May 22nd, a deadline related to Iran's current nuclear plans, or June 18th, which is the date of the first round of Iran's presidential elections. There's also the issue of Iran's missile program, their malign influence in the region, support for Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, support for the Assad regime in Syria. There's America's relations with Israel, which also color the relationship. So in this particular policy challenge. So Iran policy is a challenge much broader than the nuclear file. But again, the nuclear file is what's getting most of the headlines as of late. Closer to home, there's a situation on America's southern border, which is growing increasingly dire and that the president has called a crisis. In the interest of time, I'll skip discussing the push and pull factors. We can get into that in Q&A if you'd like. But I'd like to clarify what's actually happening on the border today, because I do think there's a lot of misinformation, and this is also playing out in our domestic politics. Yes, of course, there's a lot of desperation. There are a lot of people, and we're likely to see for 2021 a significant jump from the migration levels of the last year. But what we're actually seeing at the border is not materially different from what we saw prior to COVID-19. The truth is that we've been managing a crisis on the southern border for decades now. Every single year from 1973 to 2009, there were over 500,000 migrants apprehended at the border. And during the last decade, what we were actually seeing were historic lows in the total number of undocumented migrants seeking access to the United States. There's actually only 1 year of the prior decade where the number of migrants apprehended at the southern border peaked over 500,000, and that was in 2019. So migrants respond to weather patterns, labor demands, and enforcement regimes, not just in the United States, but also elsewhere in Latin America, especially in Mexico. And the current increase fits a pattern of seasonal changes in undocumented migration, combined with a backlog of demand because of the coronavirus border closures from the last year. What is more unusual at this moment is the increase in border crossings by undocumented minors, which appears to be more than just a seasonal pattern. And this poses a distinctive challenge for the Biden administration. Briefly, I'd like to discuss the pandemic as a foreign policy matter. Early in the pandemic, analysts were calling it a crippling setback for U.S. power, a hinge in history, presaging a rise of the authoritarian East at the expense of the West. And I remember being quite struck by an op-ed I read by Fintan O'Toole, who's an Irish Times columnist, and he wrote, quote, "The world has loved, hated, and envied the United States. Now, for the first time, we pity it." And I was really struck by that. But I'm an optimist, and I think that the current crisis is made for American leadership and that our response actually fits within the historic pattern of U.S. responses to major challenges. Somewhat slow starts and missteps, as was the case in World War I and World War II, followed by dramatic, war-winning, game-changing surges. Last year, we had a really difficult time getting our own situation with the pandemic under control. This year, and I'm not trying to downplay our continued difficulties with the virus, with daily cases numbering over 60,000, as well as our societal challenges with vaccine hesitancy. But once the United States vaccinates our own population, our policy focus will increasingly feature an effort to deal with COVID-19 as a global health challenge. And what have we seen so far? As Ida mentioned, Trump withdrew from the World Health Organization. Biden immediately rejoined it. The United States is now the largest financial donor to COVAX. We're coordinating with allies and partners to develop creative approaches to manufacturing and distributing vaccines globally. There'll also be much greater distribution of US-made vaccines much earlier than expected. And I think it's important to note that Secretary Blinken has said that we will be leading the world, not the world leader in pandemic response, leading the world. And I think that that distinction is worthy of note. Briefly on climate, because I think this is important in the context of the legislative priorities for the administration, especially infrastructure. As you know, the president convened a virtual leaders summit last week with the other major economies. This was intended to prepare and get additional commitments in advance of the COP in Glasgow later this year. Now, the main takeaway was that Biden pledged to cut U.S. carbon emissions by half by the end of this decade and aim for net zero emissions by 2050. This is one of the more aggressive near-term targets among the wealthy industrialized nations, although the cuts are arguably not as large as what the European Union promised. Almost as important as the substance was the signaling that the United States is ready to reclaim the leadership role in climate. Related to this is a loss of biodiversity. There's the power to uproot economies, make lands uninhabitable, foster zoonotic diseases, and cause competition for resources and regional unrest. And the administration has spoken of the loss of nature as a threat to our security. And there's also a China connection here. Before the Leaders Summit, John Kerry was in China to meet with counterparts. And despite tensions with other parts of the relationship, the United States and China, the two largest carbon emitters in the world, agreed to combat the climate crisis with seriousness and urgency. And while the agreement yielded few specifics, both countries vowed to discuss further emissions reductions, as well as help poorer countries develop low carbon energy sources. There's certainly things the administration can do itself through the rulemaking process, executive orders, and providing various incentives. But in order to meet these ambitious goals, they really need Congress to act. And I've thrown a lot of material out there. There's a number of other pressing foreign policy challenges we can discuss during the Q&A, but I'll leave it there and yield the floor to Congressman Moffett. Like you, I'm quite eager to hear how the administration will advance this ambitious agenda up on the Hill. So, Congressman, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think that was just a phenomenal overview of the U.S. and its foreign relations, its foreign policies, the way that it deals with its neighbors and its friends and adversaries across the world. I want to thank the AmCham terrific leadership as a convener, as a force for U.S. and Spanish economic interaction. I have the privilege of working with Spanish companies who are members of the organization, who have a significant presence in the United States. And so I'm very honored to be here. And I also want to thank all of you who are participating, especially some members of parliaments that I know of who are on board with the event, and former parliamentarians like myself. So let's get into the politics of all this, the political implications, because obviously that has a lot to do with, you know, the agenda, that massive agenda that Patrick just laid out, and whether it's really it's going to mean anything. The parties, the political parties in America, this is not the first time that there's been a huge gap, a canyon between them. But one could argue that this division is deeper and more profound than virtually any in our history. We could go back to the Civil War, but certainly in our modern history, in the last half century or so. This is a serious issue in terms of the functioning or the non-functioning of this democracy. And I think more and more people are aware that democracy is really on trial, not just in the US, but in other countries around the world. So if we look at the Republican Party, and I'm a Democrat, so you know where I'm coming from, but I hope it doesn't sound like an unfairly partisan statement to say, because I think a lot of Republicans are saying it. The Republican Party is barely recognizable in its current form. It's more like a cult. I grew up on a large estate owned by a very wealthy family. My father was the caretaker on that estate in northern Connecticut. And in that town, very large rural town, the largest town area-wise in the entire state, it's called Suffield, right on the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. The Republicans, this is in the 50s now, and I was a teenager. The Republicans in that town ran everything. They ran the local government, they ran the libraries, they ran the schools, they ran the football league, soccer as we call it, the baseball league for children, the churches, and we looked up to them. Everyone in that town looked up to them because they were the most educated, cultured, humanitarian people that we knew. None of their children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren are Republicans anymore, virtually none. This is what's happened to the Republican Party. It's been taken over by people who believe in conspiracy theories and people who are delivering huge hateful messages and actual actions toward minorities, immigrants, and so forth. Into this steps Joe Biden, who I've known for many, many decades. He and I arrived in Congress at about the same time. We worked closely with each other. He was my main supporter when I was nominated to be ambassador to Argentina, and he was a great person to have on your side. I ended up not going for other reasons, but I've known Joe. I traveled with Joe in a small plane that seated 4 people when he was running for president in 2007, before the 2008 election. So, you know, there are people like me and people much younger than me who have been around Biden and who are really in awe of his first 100 days. So if we look at the speech last night, there are a lot of clues there, right? First of all, the nouns that we used to, during the Trump years, a lot of people, including many Republicans, were almost out of adjectives, negative adjectives, to describe what was going on in our government. Now, let me throw some nouns out there that describes what's going on in our government. Sanity, civility, predictability, collaboration, capabilities, inclusiveness, and I could go on. And that's what was reflected in the speech last night, I think. And what our president, I think, the message he's delivering, that I think it's an important message for this audience, including a lot of companies, a lot of private sector people from outside the U.S. who have a presence in the U.S. There's going to be a massive commitment of government to be a positive force in helping this economy grow again. Not going to be this anti-government, we hate government, we build our political careers on attacking government or attacking minorities. That's gone. So what you'll see is massive expenditures in infrastructure defined by the administration in the broadest way. And this is one of the big debates that's going on right now between the parties. What do you call infrastructure? The minority party wants to define it as roads and bridges, maybe throw in a rail line here or there. The Biden administration wants to define it as all those things, but also as broadband for rural areas, as healthcare, to build upon the Affordable Health Care Act, because we still have tens of millions of Americans who don't have any health insurance whatsoever. Climate, as Patrick articulated so well, climate is in every piece of everything this administration is doing. So I do a lot of work in Africa, and if you look at the agencies of this government that were most recently under Trump control, now under Biden control, they're specifically looking at, in many instances, looking at projects that would have been approved for, say, loan guarantees in somewhere on the African continent, and they're pushing them off the table because of they're too fossil dependent. So you're going to see that in everything, including going right to curricula for school children. More and more states with Biden's encouragement, are developing climate curriculum for schools, for all ages of schools. A lot of people on this call are interested in trade. Again, Patrick very, I think, expertly laid out some of the quandaries there. Some people were disappointed last night because they thought that the president's speech was a little too heavy on America first. I think we're going to see that, you know. I don't think this administration is going to walk its way back to free trade in the sense that we knew it before. You saw with regard to Europe that on the luxury goods, they took actions that pleased countries in Europe, particularly the what do we call spirits industry and some of the others. But by and large, the president and his team are well aware that anxiety in the public about trade and what's viewed as unfair trade is very real and can have an impact on the elections coming up in 2022. Speaking of which, and I'll get to the end of my remarks on this, the biggest news in the past week wasn't the Biden speech here. The biggest news was the announcement of the census. In about 2 hours' time, I'll be on a call with Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and a group of Democrats to talk about strategy, legal strategy, maybe lawsuits, whatever, to counter what looks to be a very big threat to the Democratic Party in the 2022 House races, particularly. And that's because when the census results come in, and if there's a decrease in population in certain areas, those states lose seats in the Congress and other states pick them up. And so what was already going to be a very close election for control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, but especially for control of the House, could be greatly impacted by the conclusions of the Census Bureau. I think that's one thing that Biden has to worry about. Second thing he has to worry about, he laid out an ambitious agenda last night, but there's something called a filibuster in the U.S. Senate. And there's very little indication of majority support to change the filibuster rule. What that means is, on many things that he wants to do, he's going to have to get 10 Republican senators to vote on his side. That's not happening. It's just not happening. So I think there'll be a reality check on that. So I'll stop there, and we'll go to Amanda, who brings a perspective that neither Patrick nor I have, which we're anxious to hear about. Amanda?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the AmCham for this opportunity, because we are really living a very interesting time in politics, and it's a pleasure to be able to discuss with these two very great speakers. And by saying that we are living a very interesting time, I don't imply that past time was not intense, because it was, but this is too, in a different way. And I will go back to the speech yesterday too, because for me it was a turning point. 40 years ago, we heard President Ronald Reagan say to the Americans and say to the world, the government is not the solution to our problem, but is our problem. And by that, he set the political framework for decades. Even the next Democrat sitting in office, Bill Clinton, said the era of the big government is over. And yesterday night, 25 years later, we heard a 78-year-old president saying to the world and saying to the Americans in different words, but stressing this idea: the government, not only the government, but the federal government is actually the solution. And in order to make it run, we will raise taxes. And this is bold. This is a controversial political statement. And he's going forward with this in a strange environment of calm. Political polarization is still there. And obviously, after what happened on January 6th at the Capitol, you really feel there's a social problem in this country, but there's much less noise in this country, and you can feel this. President Biden, let's go first over the packages. President Biden has been able to pass a stimulus package of almost $2 trillion, but now he's pitching another $4 trillion for infrastructures and social programs. Overall, people is talking about a new deal, about a great society, and is comparing him to Roosevelt ambitions, Lyndon B. Johnson ambitions. So all this intense political activity is, as I said, happening in a strange, calm environment. And I think this is happening because of two sets of reasons. One set has to do with background, and another set has to do with Biden himself. First, vaccination is going fast, very fast in this country. Actually, the problem now is the people reluctant to get the vaccine, but there are plenty of doses for everybody. The pandemic, for the first time, seemed to be under control. And this means that many restrictions are over, which is a big relief for everybody, but especially in those conservative states where these kind of policies were highly unpopular. Meanwhile, the economy is recovering in an impressive way. The GDP is growing at the fastest pace since 1983. And there's the Federal Reserve predicts that the labor market can go back to pre-pandemic levels by the end of this year. All this is helping President Biden at polls. These days, we have been seeing many polls about his approval rating that show the same trend, but I will use the one by Pew Research in order to make fair comparisons. And in the Pew Research poll, Biden gets a 59% approval rating for his job. That means 59% of people support the way he's doing his job. This may not look like amazing, but it's 20 points higher than Donald Trump by the same time, 5 points higher than George W. Bush by the same time, and only 2 points lower than President Barack Obama. His handling of pandemic is the most, gets the highest approval rating, and the immigration issue, the lowest. And I will elaborate a little bit about this because I think it's going to be a very important part of the conversation in the coming weeks and in the coming months, and it's going to be one of the biggest challenges for President Biden. The irregular immigration has been growing as a concern for the Americans in the last year. The share of people who think it's a very serious problem has gone from 28% to 48% over the concerns about the pandemic. The concern about the pandemic, the share of people who think the pandemic is a very, very big problem has gone down from 58% to 48%. So this is going to be an important issue. But beyond all these numbers, you can really feel how things have been easing in this country. Audiences of the cable news networks have gone down. The Twitter drama is over. And former President Trump is in a very secondary position. And I think it is objective to say that this is a game changer. Also, President Biden hasn't been very exposed to media. He has been historically a gaffe-prone politician. And during these first 100 days, he has barely given one press conference, and he doesn't answer too many questions to journalists. For me, as a reporter, I wish he were more available to the press. But you have to accept that this strategy of low profile is working. It's working for him, and is working in this polarized situation. The political polarization makes that a plan that could be accepted will be rejected if it's if the president plays a very high-profile role. I don't know if I'm making myself clear with this. I'm sorry. So I think all these reasons are helping to explain this suddenly calm situation despite all the problems that are still there. And obviously, as Congressman said, this doesn't mean that this is going to be an easy time for President Biden and this is going to be an easy administration. Let's not forget that a big part of Republican voters still think that President Biden didn't win the election. Also, Republicans reject strongly all these new expense in social programs. No need to say about increasing taxes, despite Democrats say it will be only for the richest people and for the companies. So this will be a difficult time. In Congress, they keep a majority, they keep the control of the House, but in Senate, they are split 50-50, with Vice President Kamala Harris having to play the tiebreaker vote, and it will have to happen very often. She will be able to decide the result of the vote in issues related to budget, but Democrats will need a higher majority for their other policies like immigration, guns, etc. So President Biden promised a new era of more cooperation with Republicans. This has not happened so far, but some analysts say that he's like redefining what is bipartisanship, meaning he assumes he's not gonna convince Republican lawmakers, but he's gonna travel to all those conservative states and to all those battlegrounds to sell his plans. So I will not convince your congressman, but I'm gonna convince you that this is good for you. So this is what we have seen during these first 100 days. And I think this helped to explain why today he has chosen to be in Georgia, which was key in his victory, to mark these first 100 days. And I will leave it here and be happy to answer your questions.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. We invite questions from the audience. You can submit questions through the comments section, but if you'll actually just indulge me in for a moment, I want to tie together something that the Congressman said and Amanda said, and that's about the role of the state. Amanda rightly noted President Reagan's comments that government is the problem, President Clinton's comments that the era of big government is over. But I do think that we are the Congressman also noted that we are seeing a massive commitment of government under the Biden administration. So I do think that we are actually seeing an effort to revise this social contract, the relationship between the individual and the state, efforts to revise that under Reagan and Thatcher to shrink the state. Those largely failed, and the Biden administration is trying to move this turn this massive ship itself. So that's just my own editorial comment. We will now turn to questions. The first one concerns immigration. I'm going to just read it out verbatim. Immigration seems to be a thorny issue in the U.S. How do you think Joe Biden will make good on his promises in this area, and what would be the next steps? Congressman, why don't we toss this to you, seeing as though the action on this matter is up on the Hill?
Sure. Immigration is generally viewed as a super difficult issue. Very, very complex, very controversial. But I happen to believe that there is an immigration reform coalition that's potentially a coalition. And here are the pieces. It's not very complicated. Okay. On the one hand, those who have been advocating for what we call the dreamers, who are already in the United States, who are part of our society, but who are not yet citizens. I think all the polls show that there's substantial majority for doing something to straighten that part of the equation out. And so that's really about, compassion, but it's also about, do we understand the role that these people are playing in improving our country and in playing key roles in different sectors, whether it's the first line hospital, healthcare workers, or people without whom the big farms in California can't get their produce to market. So take that piece. That's one. So the United Farm Workers, all the various civil society groups, pro-immigration groups, that's one part of the puzzle. Second part of the puzzle, and I know we have a big contingent of people from global companies at this event, is to straighten out the huge problems that the Trump administration caused with regard to highly skilled workers. I in my own practice have spent so much time with so many clients who had problems because their own employees could not get visas from the U.S. Embassy in a particular country to come to the United States. I'll give you a perfect example. I was at Mayer Brown, the law firm, before I came to Mercury. We had a client, massive company that you all know, called Intel. Intel was trying to bring 23 of its talented Chinese engineers, employees of Intel, to the United States because they were in the process of trying to build a massive factory in New Mexico all around 5G. And guess what? The US Embassy in Beijing, which formerly had approved these very routinely, said, no, we're not giving the visas to these workers. And they were coming to the United States to train their counterparts, their US fellow Intel employees, in 5G technology. So Biden has that piece of the equation as well. So I think, Patrick, to our questioner, I'm much more optimistic than a lot of people on the prospects for getting a coalition together and having a very broad, comprehensive immigration reform bill.
Great. I want to get Amanda's thoughts on this in terms of the broader political context.
Yeah.
Congressman, I do want to toss this back to you and quickly follow up. Now, the president has indicated that he's open to a piecemeal immigration bill to kind of ease some of the gridlock. Obviously, comprehensive immigration reform has been stalled for decades. There's been good faith efforts from various gangs of 6, gangs of 8, gangs of 12, et cetera, over the past few decades. Now, in light of those failures, what do you think as a tactician, as a legislative strategist of a piecemeal approach, whether it's peeling off the dreamers, whether it's easing some of the bureaucratic barriers to attracting talent from overseas that you just articulated with your example?
Sure. You know, there was a book back in the 60s. I hate to date myself so much, but when I was a student, called The Dance of Legislation by Eric Redmond. And it was sort of, very maybe still is a popular textbook for students studying government and particularly the Congress. And I always like to say those of us who advocate for various things in Washington are really choreographers. If you look at the legislative process as a dance, every dance is different, complicated. The most complicated would be a tango, I suppose. But so my own view on how I would choreograph an immigration reform, I don't think you can do it in pieces, Patrick. I think you have to have the Intels of the world, the American Express companies of the world. I mean, most of us are not aware of how much these big companies are hugely dependent on foreign skilled labor. And so you have to have them advocating for the dreamers, and you have to have the United Farm Workers saying, we're for this whole comprehensive legislation that includes the H-1B or whatever the visas are that these big corporations need. I mean, that's the nature of a coalition, right? So I think that's the way it has to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's right. There are certain pieces of this that have greater gravity to pull a larger package across the goal line. Now, Amanda, and you're well steeped in the polling data and the broader societal perspectives. What's your take on the immigration agenda?
So I also think that the disagreement between Democrats and Republicans regarding immigration has been overstated during last few years, because actually Trump's stance regarding immigration wasn't even the traditionally Republican stance regarding immigration. As long as I know, I think there was kind of a consensus regarding the need to protect the dreamers, and also that you have to find a path to make to give documents, to make regular all these millions of immigrants who are living, working, and paying taxes in this country. There was, I think, some consensus regarding that. I think that this disagreement maybe it's closer to the new immigration and the new numbers and refugees policies, but I think that the political environment and the political rivalry has made this issue look worse than it really is. So that doesn't mean I think they are gonna get to agree because of this, and because we also have to see what role does President Trump and the people in the party that want to take the role of President Trump play in the conversation, because this will affect the stances of the rest of the Republicans.
Absolutely, thanks. Next question concerns climate, and the questioner notes the EU's pledge to eliminate over half of their CO2 emissions by 2030, and asks whether the United States contemplates specific plans in this area. So let me just take the first swing at this. Now, during last week's Leaders Summit, the president pledged to cut American emissions by half by the end of this decade, very ambitious goal, and to be net zero by 2050. So that there's not that great degree of specificity within that top line pledge. Part of it is they're banking on embedding on technology that hasn't been developed yet. Part of it is also that in the Americans' in the president's Build Back Better plan, there's plans for green infrastructure. There's also an environmental equity component of it. There's stuff as granular as green building codes and building back more resilient and better materials associated with that. One thing and I'm gonna bring Congressman into this to talk about how things stand on the Hill, but I think globally, the president can only do so much in terms of his pledges and things that he can do through the executive office of the president, through rulemaking and regulatory matters. But what really needs to send a signal to the broader international community is something to be enacted in law to demonstrate our sustained commitment. And the president needs Congress to do that. So Congressman, over to you to talk about how you see the climate agenda shaping up on the Hill.
Sure. I think, Patrick, that you did a really good job in your opening remarks on that. And and I think that this is not easy. Everybody knows that. But it's also not totally impossible. I mean, one of the problems we have here in the U.S. and other countries to a certain extent is all these conspiracy theorists. So, you know, the big conspiracy theory the past 10 days was that Biden is going to take your hamburgers away or your cheeseburgers, or because he's going to ban beef, and every American will only have a certain amount of beef that they can eat. And that a lot of that has to do with his position on climate and the enormous carbon footprint that comes from the producing of meats for our population. It was absolutely not true, but this has gone crazy on the internet. But what he is doing is letting the public know that there are stark choices on the horizon. I mean, how can we even mention climate without honestly conveying how stark and brutal these choices are for everyone, not just in terms of sweeping broad policies for every government, whether they're a democracy or an authoritarian country, but in our individual lives. I think there's more and more awareness of it. And I think, oddly, coincidentally, I think COVID has helped people understand that, the sort of how they're connected to the world and how their actions impact on things like climate change. Look, what is John Kerry doing in this position? He's in his 70s. He's had one of the most distinguished careers in American history, from decorated Vietnam War veteran to U.S. Senator to Secretary of State. This is a reflection of how serious the problem is, of the president's commitment and the vice president's commitment, and our party's commitment, by the way, to addressing this problem. And John Kerry, who has money, I'm sure he has a lot of money, he doesn't need to be doing this. And so when the United States, with all its imperfections and all its divisions, pulls its chair up to the table on climate discussions, we have a lot to talk about. We have a John Kerry, basically, who could be in retirement or could be, making millions of dollars in the private sector, is actually coming in after having been Mr. Secretary of State. Now he's a climate envoy, but he's willing to do that. So I think You know, and I do think, by the way, Patrick, your mention of the Kerry meetings with the Chinese counterparts, you know, is just hugely important. If with all the problems in the bilateral relationship, the Chinese and Americans can carve out this area of cooperation, I mean, that's a historic, and I think it will happen, by the way. I think it's a historic event.
Yeah.
So, Amanda, sorry.
No, Amanda, do you have any thoughts on the climate matter?
I would say I will go back to the speech yesterday, because I would say that Biden spoke about this issue in a very smart way, because he tried to fight this idea of, okay, the environmental policies, the fight to climate change means I'm going to lose my job at the coal mine, I'm going to lose my job at the factory. And he just addressed the blue-collar worker, and he said, I know what you feel, I know what you fear, I promise these jobs are for you. These are jobs not for college people. These are jobs for you, electric workers, new factories. And he then used the word green jobs, because green jobs doesn't sound like a factory job. And I think this has been a political mistake for a long time. And yesterday, for me, it was surprising and interesting the way he spoke about climate. He said, when I think of climate change, I only think of jobs, 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 which was what Trump said every time, jobs, jobs, jobs. Yesterday, we heard the word jobs like 40 times. And link the idea of factories, of blue-collar workers to climate change is the way to do this, I think.
Absolutely. Part of yesterday was selling that exact idea to the American people. Next question is concerning trade and asking about transatlantic trade relations. I think I'll take this one first. Just grand scheme of things, the trade agenda is focused on two things. One is enforcement, and one is China. And regarding the latter, it's going to be working with friends and allies to implement necessary reforms, whether it's at the WTO or address issues within the global trading system that allow for China's practices to go on. But I don't see, in terms of any types of agreements, I don't see that happening. Congressman, I would assume you see the same. Nothing really on the Hill in terms of trade agreements.
Well, certainly, the Chinese issue is front and center, and has to be addressed. Truth in Advertising, our firm represents a number of Chinese companies with a significant U.S. presence. And what I've thought about in terms of looking at these issues, obviously where there's a clear security risk to the United States, that's sort of a no-brainer. We have to protect ourselves. And, post-SolarWinds hack, the administration is discovering just how horrible a challenge this is, because we're not really protecting ourselves. So that's part of the whole equation here. But in terms of these two big countries, the China and the US, I think in one way it's simple. Each country has to decide how it's going to treat the other country's major global companies. So how are the Chinese treating Apple? Or how are the Chinese treating Caterpillar? And how are we treating their companies? And is there a space there for some agreement that, look, you have big global companies, we have big global companies. They have to be able to operate. They have to have some sort of freedom of operation to do their work, because our two countries are more intertwined than anybody really imagines. So, I'm pretty optimistic that I understand where the Biden people are coming from. I understand when you look at our Democratic Party base, there's a lot of anxiety around jobs and losing jobs and threats from the Chinese or other countries. But I do think that some progress is is possible there. Again, going back to the difference with the last administration: predictability, sanity, collaboration, etc.
Thank you, Congressman. By my clock, that does bring us to the top of the hour. It's 11 a.m. on the East Coast of the United States. It's 5 p.m. for our friends in Barcelona and elsewhere. 100-day mark is a point at which we can be retrospective in looking at what the administration has accomplished, but also prospective in looking at the ambitious agenda that they have over the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. But that's all the time we have for today. For those on the line, thanks for joining us. Congressman, it's been truly a pleasure and an honor sharing the virtual stage with you. Amanda, you as well. I guess I'll just pivot. I'll toss the controls back to our friends at AmCham. Or just simply close out.